Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the University of Aberdeen COP26 Sustainable Futures Seminars. My name is Professor Tavis Potts. We have a great lineup for you today on this very cold, windy, stormy Storm Arwen day that's currently sweeping the land. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, David Burchelm, he's lost his internet, probably due to aforementioned storm. So we're hoping David can rejoin us through the next half an hour or not. Otherwise, we will be down a speaker. But just while we just give it a minute or two to let people arrive and settle in and grab a cup of tea, just to introduce our great panel today. Our topic for today is helping people, economies and environment adapt and prepare for the impacts of climate change. Just one look out the window today probably helps us on that journey. We're going to have Dr. John Bone, who's the Interim Director of the Centre for Social Inclusion and Cultural Diversity. We'll have, hopefully David will be able to join us later on, but we'll see how the internet connection goes. It's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Alice Haye from the James Hutton Institute and the Social, Economic and Geographical Studies Group. I believe that's close or correct. And Professor Jenny McDiarmid, who's the Interim Director, the Director of Health, Nutrition, and the Permanent Director of the Health, Nutrition and Wellbeing Challenges, University of Aberdeen, all bringing very different views about the concepts of adaptation and resilience as we face the impact of climate change. So we'll just give it another minute or so while everybody arrives, and then we'll kick off with the first speaker in the series. Okay, it's now 3 minutes past the hour, so we'll make a start on our panel session today. So welcome everybody, and hope you're all safe, warm, and comfortable in this pretty challenging weather today. The first talk will be leading off will be myself talking about adaptation, resilience, and just transition, making the links with some exploration of a local case study. They're short, sharp talks today, so we hope to leave plenty of time for discussion at the end of the talks with you. So climate resilience and climate action generally revolves around two different concepts or two different forms, and on one side of it is the idea of mitigation, which are actions that reduce our emissions, and this classic example is the development of clean energy and sustainable transport and energy efficiency. And on the other side of the climate coin is the notion of adaptation, which are really about actions that reduce the impacts of climate change and also to maximize the opportunities. Now, in the traditionally within the process of COP negotiations, has been a sense of that adaptation has been not as strong a focus as mitigation efforts. And the adaptation hasn't really received the attention that it has deserved. And this I felt was very prominent within the COP26 negotiations, where adaptation really came up the agenda quite strongly. Without going too far into this slide, there are a whole range of outcomes we can revisit around adaptation, but notable was developed nations doubling their provision of climate finance around adaptation by 2025 to 40 billion in adaptation funding. Just a drop in the ocean what's actually required, but certainly a major stepping up the commitment there. And also a lot of discussion and progress towards developing a global goal on adaptation and a work program, actually how we measure adaptation, because adaptation is a very contextual issue. It affects different places in different ways. So certainly an increasing role of adaptation on the agenda to be on par with mitigation efforts. Just to capture just some of these key terms, overarching key terms, adaptation, when we talk about adaptation, there may be different views on this from our speakers. but it's about adjustments in ecological, social or economic systems in response to climatic drivers. Essentially, it's changing processes, practices and structures to adapt, to incorporate this damage or to benefit from the opportunities. Adaptation I see as a state, whereas resilience I see as a capacity of a unit. This could be an individual or a community or an ecosystem or region or even a country to be able to deal and cope with change, to bounce back, to absorb and withstand after an adverse event. So resilience is very much a capacity. And I see just transition as very much something that unifies resilience and adaptation. If resilience is a capacity and adaptation is a state, then a just transition is really a process. And there are various definitions about just transition, but building an environmentally sustainable economy which provides which needs to be well managed and planned and contribute to fairness and equity and decent jobs for all, social inclusion and the eradication of poverty. So we really need that process to be in place as we develop resilience, and as resilience enables us to deal with a changing climate and the problems that can bring. So a very brief case study of something I'm working on at the moment here in Aberdeen is around the energy transition zone and around the how the energy transition zone is working within the city and some challenges it has around a local green space site. So the ETZ is a development proposal that is currently going through the master planning process and received considerable support from the Scottish and UK government. What it is, it aims to develop a number of local greenfield and brownfield sites. Those ideas are still being worked through in proximity to the new South Harbour. And this will support investment in low carbon technologies and industries. It's very strongly aligned to supporting the energy sector and the energy industry in northeast Scotland with the transition to net zero, so diversifying from oil and gas essentially into new low carbon industries. So it has a very laudable goal and something that generally has very strong support in doing so. But a central part of the proposition is actually to develop St Fittick's Park, which is a very valuable local community green space and nature site south of Torry in Aberdeen. So this is the picture of this is a slightly older picture, and I'll insert it here where the new harbour is going in. You can see this area, if you can see my mouse here, is essentially a slightly older picture of St Fittick's Park. It's been restored from essentially a grass field with a culvert, contaminated water drainage running through it, into a forest and a series of wetlands and a thriving biodiverse site. And this is the centre here of which will be potentially one of the key aspects of the energy transition zone next to the new harbour. And this raises some real challenges around both adaptation and resilience and just transition, something that we need to get right in the development process. It's also a social and economic context to this story. Torry down here is very much one of the deprived, poorer communities of the city. And this area here around the coast is where the industrial proposition is to be based. And also this is the last remaining green space for this community in this part of the city. So a very important site. This site has a number of narratives and a number of perspectives behind it. It is a forest, it is a wetland, it is a nature site, it is a place for building community capacity, but it's also now seen as a site of development opportunity, and all those things around resilience and adaptation and mitigation are all coming together. And as we've seen in the global climate debates, how adaptation has been probably a less focus than mitigation, so we do see at the local level where mitigation seems to be one of the dominant narratives and adaptation resilience is struggling to be heard. I'll skip that in the interest of time, just to say that people have been consulted in the community about the things that are important to them, and many of these issues are to do with resilience and adaptation. Spaces to grow more food, outdoor spaces, health, support, community. So what are the key issues here? This is my last slide. What are the key issues that this particular issue raises? In terms of adaptation, St Fittick's Park has developed adaptive capacity by a decadal program of ecosystem restoration, from a contaminated burn to a biodiverse wetland site. It provides flood alleviation, water quality, and a range of ecosystem services. In terms of resilience, the research that we've been doing with the communities identified this park as a reservoir of resilience, supporting social capital, health and well-being, communities, and local development. Seems to be a policy and planning disconnect here for strengthening resilience capacity. And can the development proposals actually improve resilience rather than remove it? In terms of the just transition, what are some of the acceptable trade-offs that we need to make? Who decides how these trade-offs are made? How do we actually balance mitigation efforts, i.e. renewable energy, with adaptation efforts and community resilience of societies? There is a genuine governance issue and a lack of engagement and asymmetry of voices in the debate. And we really have to be conscious of how we incorporate the needs of deprived communities in this process of change. What is their voice? And what is their voice in the development process as we collectively address climate change in the northeast of Scotland, but also more broadly around the world? So that's just a touch point there of this issue. I'll finish up there, and I'm happy to take questions as I hand over to our next speaker. So I'll call Dr. John Bone to the stand. Thanks, John.
Right, I am just bringing up my slides at the moment. And here we are. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I was asked to talk this morning about community and community resilience in the face of the challenge of climate change. And one of the things that occurred to me is that this seemed to me to be quite ironic. There's a major irony here. Firstly, we know that overconsumption is one of the key elements of climate change, if not the major element that contributes to climate change. So we consume too much, we consume too many resources, we use too much energy, and so on and so forth. The irony is, however, that the communities that have to confront this situation, there is a question mark over what community is in contemporary society. And it occurred to me that much of what binds us together in the early 21st century is A, very fragile, and B, importantly, it's founded on the very overconsumption, what remains of communities, founded on the very overconsumption that we need to confront to deal with climate change. And I want to unpack this and talk a little bit about how we came to this position and where we might go from here. Okay, so how did we get to the stage where we become fragile consumerist communities? Well, in the first instance, when we urbanised, we became more individualistic. Our societies became more atomised, and as people like Louis Wirth suggested, the community started to be lost, the community lost argument. We started to dissipate, we became more isolated, we developed a society of strangers. And in a society of strangers, we become more dependent on appearance. Traditional societies, people knew one another. They were bound together by kinship ties, they were bound together by knowing one another quite deeply. They very rarely encountered strangers. Certainly the small villages and towns of the pre-industrial area, that was the case. But in the cities, the industrial cities, people identify each other on the basis of appearance. Now, with mass production techniques, the availability of more goods needed to, we needed to find markets to sell those goods, and at the same time, people wanted to be able to express their identity through appearance in city space, to have others identify their status, who they were, and so on and so forth. And consumer culture started to develop on this basis. So industrialists employed advertisers to explain to to try and convince people to use consumer products as a basis of identifying themselves in public space. So in terms of clothing, in terms of what they owned, at the same time, they also persuaded them to buy goods based on their fashion, what they said about them, their fashionability, what trends they depicted, what status they depicted. And in this way, they also persuaded them to waste things, rather than to buy goods for their use value, to buy goods for what they said about them, and to discard them when they were no longer fashionable. And in this way, we made a transition from being citizens to becoming consumers. And we started to have consumer identities. How we understood each other, how we identified each other in public space was based on what we owned and what we wore, coming from consumer culture. Also, community spaces. We no longer had the city square where people met. We no longer had the village hall where people met. The main places people started to meet were consumer spaces. So we have conspicuous consumption, people who identify themselves and each other on the basis of conspicuous consumption and who meet in consumer spaces. Now, some people argued there was more to community than this. So in the mid-20th century, we had suburban communities, we had ethnic communities, we had workplace communities. The Simpsons, for example, where people worked in the local plant and lived in suburbia, in a sort of community where they went bowling together and so on and so forth. However, it's been argued that with metropolitan sprawl, and we know with increasing mobility, people move around for jobs a lot, these communities started to erode. And this is where Robert Putnam, a couple of decades ago, suggested that social capital, even in suburbia, was beginning to erode. These workplace communities were breaking down, people were changing jobs, and they were also moving around a lot more. So even those thin ties of community were breaking down, and all that was left were patterns of consumption. So the people we live near, the people we know, we often don't know our neighbours very well. What actually connects us is little more than the fact that we live in the same kind of houses, we drive the same kinds of cars, and we have a similar lifestyle based on consumerism. And when we look at even the web was supposed to connect us, but the web and social media, as we know, differentiates us and divides us as much as it connects us. We have filter bubbles and silos that push us down different rabbit holes and make us more different from each other. We all used to watch the same type of television programs. Now with the proliferation of channels and streaming, we're no longer exposed even to the same cultural content. So what we have in terms of communities that can confront climate change are communities that are no longer real communities. They're fragile quasi-communities. And the very thing that we want them to tackle is the last remnant that pulls them together. So where do we go? Well, the question is, how do we build real and resilient communities? We have to look at ways of pulling people together in meaningful communities that go beyond superficial patterns of consumption. In the first instance, we've got to think about urban space. If people are living in amorphous, multipolitan regions, how do we create new spaces? How we take spaces and turn them into places that are meaningful for people? And we could turn to the work of people like Jane Jacobs in building livable communities in cities with squares and proper locales. We've also got to give people time for community. We know that in a lot of our culture, we're very overworked. But we also know that the workplace is changing. And this transition, Tavis mentioned a just transition. This transition's got to be just because we could be moving towards a scenario with automation and so on, where some people work very little, some people overwork in several gig jobs and so on. How does this play out? How do we move from society 4.0, where maybe we can give people, where people have less work or different kinds of work, to society 5.0, where work is shared, there's more leisure time, and there's more time to forge real communities, and where we can give people space to find solutions to the climate challenges that confront them. Also, we need economic reform, because as we move through these transitions and work becomes more differentiated, we're now in a situation where inequality is rising. We know that that's an issue, and that also undercuts community. If people are highly unequal, then they do not connect with others. The more differentiated we are from other people, the more difficult it is for us to forge bonds with them, to forge real connections. So we have to look at how people are supported, how secure they are, and also how we reduce the inequalities between them, to enable them to have common ground in which real communities can be forged. And evidently also new consumption practices, where we're no longer so dependent on expressing our identities and identifying the groups we belong to by consumer consumption, overconsumption. A move to a circular economy where this becomes less important. We move back to using products for their use value, not for their exchange value, not for what they say about us, and we find new ways of living that become meaningful, where consumption is just something we do to sustain ourselves. And to do that, we've also got to do things like replace GDP as a measure, a key measure of societal well-being, and look to other measures. So I'm going to finish, and I'm going to finish by talking about COP26, just very briefly. COP26 talks about community resilience and adaptation as key elements of confronting climate change, but have not considered the fact that consumer identities are based on this, that our communities are based on overconsumption, and the consumerist growth model still remains intact and hasn't been confronted. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. That was really, really thought-provoking. Some fantastic points in there for us to consider. Just to note to everybody before we bring up Jenny onto the stand is that if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A and we'll pick them up and discuss them afterwards. So without further ado, hand over to Professor McDermott from the Director of Health, Nutrition and Wellbeing Challenges. Thank you, Jenny.
Hi, thank you. What I want to follow on from that is to talk a little bit about the food system in terms of adaptation and resilience. This is something that is going to change because of climate change, and we're going to have to adapt to that and create a system that is resilient. So
you just muted yourself, Jenny.
Sorry. So if we just talk about what the food system is, we've got this diagram down on the left-hand side, which is a simplified diagram of the diagram on the top right-hand side. And basically the food system is everything from production through processing, through consumption to food waste. And what you can see from the top bar is the fact that it's influenced by all sorts of drivers, where it's political, where there's social economic drivers, there's biodiversity, etc. So there are all these things, and what we need to do is look at how we can make this more resilient, and we've got to adapt, because while we're looking at trying to reach net zero, the food system is going to play a huge role in this, because about 30% of emissions globally come from the food system. But what we need to do is adapt to this, particularly in lower income countries where we're going to see more extreme weather, and this is going to have a big impact on what can be produced. It's still going to, it will also have an impact in terms of across the UK and Scotland as weather changes. And we need to think about this in terms of adaptation, not just in terms of what people sort of produce, but also the impact it's going to have on people. So we need a resilient food system, so we have enough food, but we also need to look at how we can adapt to what we need to do to change. And what I want to do is just take a couple of issues from COP that came out, some of the pledges that came up and declarations, and what this means for the food system and what it means for producers and what it means for us as consumers. So one of the declarations was to halt and reverse deforestation, and this was to reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030, which is a big challenge, and this is going to have a huge impact because so much of that is associated with food production. So tropical forestation, a lot of the deforestation is due to beef production, so cattle farming, but also palm oil and soybeans. A lot of the soybeans are going to cattle and cattle feed, but palm oil is really something that is really prevalent throughout our whole food system. If you look at any processed food, you'll be really struggle to find a product that doesn't have palm oil in it. It's because it's highly versatile as an oil, but this is, as we've seen, we've heard, it is causing a lot of deforestation. So if we are to sort of reverse some of this, restore some of the land, and we have less land to produce these products, how's this going to change our food system? How are we going to adapt to that? What are we going to do in terms of what's being produced? How's it going to affect livelihoods? So while we look at all of these things, whether it's deforestation in the tropics or halting deforestation in agricultural land, this is something that is going to have to be adapted to, and we're going to have to look at what food choices that we're making. The other one was the pledge around methane, so a 30% reduction in methane emissions by 2030. Again, agriculture is a major source of methane. This is particularly from ruminants, because they produce methane. Their digestive system is such that they burp out methane. And so this is where the big push you've probably seen in trying to reduce meat consumption. You also get methane from rice paddy fields. So this has been less focused on because it isn't as high as ruminants, but this is another area where methane reductions can happen. So there are two ways about going about this. There's technological solutions. So there's a lot of work going on to see what can be done to change farms, to change production systems so that we can reduce methane, but also behaviour change. The technological solutions aren't going to be fast enough to meet these challenges that we're doing. But I think we need to look at what is the adaptation. What does this actually mean for livelihoods? It's easy to say these are the targets we've got, but we've got farmers, we've got people where this is their livelihoods. It has been for years. So just to say stop producing livestock isn't the way forward. So as I say, there's some solutions that can be done on farms, but I think in terms of adaptation, we really need to look at the economy, we need to look at livelihoods, and what does this mean? How can we help this transition? And the same with behaviour change. We will need to change. If we're going to meet these targets, we are going to have to make changes to our diet. But again, how are we going to adapt to that? How are we going to encourage it? Is it going to be affordable? Is it going to be affordable to everybody? So this is a sort of just transition, not around energy, but how do we make sure it's equitable, the changes that we're making, what we're asking people to do, and what food is going to be available. So food systems are playing a really big role in sort of not just mitigation, but we really need to sort of talk about how we're going to adapt to this so that it doesn't disadvantage people. So just to sort of finish up, adaptation, it will change our food production systems. What we're looking for is sustainable agricultural systems, but again, as I've said, we're going to have to look at dietary changes. This has all got to be supported in all sorts of ways because people can't just change this overnight. And in terms of resilience, what we're trying to achieve is to produce sufficient, accessible, affordable, sustainable, healthy food. Because it's got to be accessible and affordable. These are sometimes forgotten in sort of talking about healthy food systems. We need enough, we need it to be sustainable, we need it to be healthy, but absolutely key to this, it's got to be accessible and affordable to people. So just to touch on a bit of research that's happening in Aberdeen, there's a lot of work going on food security and food insecurity. This is at a local, national, international level. There's a lot of work looking around sustainable, healthy diets. What does this mean? How can we make transitions to this without sort of introducing more inequalities? There's other work on sustainable agriculture and aquaculture. A lot of work on soil science, because the soil is absolutely key, obviously, for food production and healthy food production. And I believe that it's just been announced that Aberdeen University Soil Science Group has been awarded the Queen's Award, which is a really high, prestigious award to have won. So on that really positive note, I will stop there.
Thanks, Jenny. That's a really succinct summary of a really complex set of issues. So thanks for condensing that down for us. So now I'd like to hand over to Dr. Alice Haye, joining us from the James Hutton Institute and giving us some insight into some adaptation issues and programs in the northeast of Scotland. So Alice, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Have you got the right screen up? Yes. Yeah, great. Yeah, no, I say it's great to be here. Really appreciate the invite to what's a really interesting conversation. As Tavis has said, I think one of the things that rose up the agenda at COP26 was action about adapting to the impacts of climate change, and a call for more action on, also there was a call for more action on locally led climate adaptation. And so thinking about the Northeast, I've been doing some research with a group called Climate Ready Aberdeenshire, so a number of locally based organisations and companies and local authority about what climate adaptation in the Northeast looks like. And I think events like this are great because I think one of the challenges in thinking about climate adaptation is understanding first of all what we mean by talking about the need to adapt, and the sense of what can be done by organisations, by companies, by communities and individuals. So I think when it comes to the Northeast, we're already experiencing the impacts of climate change. The warmer, drier summers that have affected private water supplies, for example, in Aberdeenshire. The wetter winters, the kind of excessive rainfall patterns and storms. Storm Frank in, was it 2015, 2016 is an obvious one to refer back to. And obviously the more recent landslide and tragedy at Carmont. And so we know that we need to take action to prevent future climate impacts, but it's not easy. I think one of the challenges thinking about adaptation is it's not necessarily easy to quantify or measure. And in our research, we found that the kind of terminology, the language of net zero has been a great motivator for action. Companies, governments, we can take action to reduce emissions and climate impacts of our own work, but there's still a lot of confusion about what's necessary in terms of taking action to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So in the Northeast, and particularly thinking more about the rural areas, you know, we've got this huge coastline and a lot of area that isn't urban. And I think one of the biggest challenges is connectivity, thinking about infrastructure, thinking about transport, supply routes, and the large number of bridges. I think learning from the experience of Storm Frank, we know that one bridge being damaged can affect the wider area in terms of access and supplies and services, emergency services, unable to cross a bridge, which meant they were unable to service wide areas that they previously had done. I think the hyper-local aspect of climate adaptation is important as well, which leaves local authorities with challenges about where to spend limited resources of time and money. So some of the aspects of some of the impacts of climate change might only affect a very small number of people or properties, but it could affect them significantly. And so how do you spend limited resources in terms of trying to meet the needs of a large number of people? I think our research has shown that thinking about integrating climate change into company and risk assessment documents is an important way to kind of increase awareness and get people thinking about how climate change might affect them in the next few years. And I think that's one of the other issues we came across is how do you try and encourage people to think 5 to 10 years into the future to understand how the actions we can take today can be beneficial both immediately and into the future. I think takes a long time to implement changes. The Stonehaven flood prevention scheme is a good example of a project that will take nearly 10 years from kind of conception to finish, and that's assuming things run to time. So I think while some of the topics addressed at COP26 can sometimes seem very high level and very distant from the situation on the ground, the reality is that discussions and decisions taken there, they impact policy at the UK and in Scotland, which then influences and needs local level action to be implemented. And so that includes us. And so I think while the North East might have different types of climate adaptation needs from some other areas of the UK, we're not expecting temperatures to rise to the levels we'll see in the south of England, for example. There are a lot of adaptation actions already underway, but a lot more needed to help us prepare for a climate change future. So I think this kind of local level action and leadership from councils as well as public and private sector organisations is important in engaging people and communities and helping them to understand the likely future impacts of climate change in their local area, and then can help to point people towards the resources and solutions that can be taken at the local and community level to adapt to climate change. And with that, I'll hand back to Tavis.
Thank you very much, Alice. I'm just going to check. I believe we don't have David Versalm joining us. I don't think so. No, the internet is definitely conked out there, so not to worry. We're sorry that we lost one of our speakers today, but we do have an additional seminar series also coming up on safeguarding ecosystems, protecting natural habitats and keeping carbon out of the atmosphere on the 10th of December, which David is chairing. So there's a wee plug for him there on that. So we have some questions coming through of the audience. So I'm just going to switch to the question screen. So some time we can all come on and discuss some of these big topics that are being raised. Let me just get the first question up. Okay, so this one's from Beck, and I'm just going to open them to everyone to comment. Do you think that identity politics can still be useful in helping develop communities to help promote sustainability? I think this is going to land on John's desk.
Oh, thank you for that, Tavis.
Oh, that's a good, right. Okay, I'm glad you're happy with that one.
No, that's a bit of a hot potato. I mean, there are two sides really to this. In the first instance, I think in some ways identity politics has been useful in challenging prejudices in society and by helping particular groups in society to challenge stigma around their particular identities and so on. That's quite important. At the same time, though, one of the things we have to do is not forget our common humanity. There's always the possibility of going down into the kind of silos I'm talking about, groups becoming siloed online through social media. And I know from my own work, one of the issues we have as human beings is that when we define other people as being different, it's harder for us to empathise with them. It's harder for us to connect with them, and it's harder to forge the kind of communities that I was talking about. So community is based on a sense of mutual identification. So in part, what we've got to do is, recognise people's different identities, recognise their different needs, but also have a more concerted effort in recognising our common humanity and the fact that climate change of itself is something that confronts the whole of humanity, and we've got to deal with it as a collective identity, you know, from a collective perspective.
Any other viewpoints on that question? No, it's okay. Ahead. No, Kate, no worries. I'm going to go to the next question then. This is from Anonymous, not the Anonymous, I assume. In terms of a just transition, how do we ensure global sustainability and solidarity between communities on a global scale if people in developed countries reduce their consumption, And what effect does that have on producers and workers in developing countries? Well, that's a good question. They shouldn't be anonymous, because that's a great question. They should own that question.
Yeah, a difficult question.
Yeah, any takers?
Great question.
Food production.
Is it maybe the case that we have to go back to more local production and consumption and less globalized production and consumption? If we think about it, contemporary society has been based on these global trade, and there's all this emphasis on global trade. And part of the problem with climate change is we're moving goods all over the world. There's going to have to be a very, very fundamental rethink, and this is a challenge that's going to be, in a world where there's geopolitical tensions and so on. It's going to be very difficult to confront this, because this has got to be confronted on a global level. We need the large global players to come together, and that's going to be extremely difficult. It may take a big climate shock to bring them to the table, or an even bigger climate shock than the ones we've experienced thus far. But the point is that we do need to spread the capacity for people to be able to sustain themselves globally. And it may be that we need to move back to more local production. We might have to move back to a form of tech medieval society, of small, close-knit communities, producing things with each other. Yeah, maybe high tech in the background, but that kind of society. This is going to be a radical shift. We're going through all these changes, and people we're cognitive misers. We tend to think that what's happened in the past is going to be what happens in the future. And that's not necessarily the case. If you'd lived in the 1700s, 100 years later, we had a massively different type of society. If you'd lived in 470 AD, the Roman Empire had always been there, and then it was gone. We're at that kind of transition, I think. And we've got to think really out of the box as to what sort of society we want and how we can manage it. And it could be very, very different from the world we live in now, and it has to be.
I'm going to put Jenny on the spot here. Food question in relation to this question, because consumption obviously is a key factor, and global consumption in food is a really important issue. So do we really need avocados, bananas and strawberries in winter? And how does that then go back and impact on producers in those countries, and how do we, because that's a part of the question, right? If we reduce our consumption of these products, then we are, even if it's fair trade or things like that, we are impacting producers in those countries. So how do we get this right?
Well, if I could answer that, that'd be amazing. But I think what we do need to be is very, very mindful of that. To just cut something off and say we're not going to trade anymore, that won't affect us because we can't have strawberries in December. It may not be what we want, but taking that from where that's a lot of income, particularly in developing countries. So I think we do really need to sort of make sure that we look at the knock-on effects of any radical change that we make, so it doesn't actually disadvantage developing countries. It's going to have to look, because what can be produced in a lot of these countries is going to change with climate change. We won't be able to produce a lot of what we're importing at the moment with water scarcity and things like this. So it's going to take both sides. We're going to have to be prepared, if we're going to say we want to be more local around our food, not to have strawberries, bananas, avocados, etc. And we know from data that these are all the things that people eat to get their 5 a day. Sort of potatoes, kale and apples don't feature quite so highly. So we've got an issue here around what are we going to do to adapt to this? Are we willing to change what we're doing? But think about the knock-on effects in developing countries. So working together, so not just cutting it off, but what could be produced in developing countries that may have a lower impact will be more sustainable, and can feed into a global market, because that's one way of people getting out of poverty. Is to be able to create a market. So I think it's really complicated, and how we do it isn't obvious, But I think the absolute key thing is to look at the whole system to make sure we don't make a decision in one system and it affects somewhere negatively. And I think that that's this sort of diagram that I showed about the food system and how complex it is. Making a global food system, you put another layer on top of that. But if we stand back and say, okay, it's too complicated, we're only going to look at this little section, we're not going to import avocados, then we're going to end up with sort of unintended consequences around the world. So I can't answer your question of how to do it, but I can tell you a lot of things that we need to be really mindful of if we are going to move towards this sort of a solution which may be seen as more local food.
Thanks, Jenny. That's a great answer. And there's a question here from David Isaac, and which is again about citizenship. And I want to bring in both John and Alice into this. But how do we push the need for citizenship over consumer identity, especially within the social media space? And some of the work that we've been doing here at the university around, we're halfway through a project, Just Transition in Northeast Communities, where we're really bringing the civil society elements of Just Transition to the fore in the Northeast. And we've really found that working the climate challenge at a community level is one of the ways that we can create this an identity around citizenship and engagement, around empowering youth, around providing real employment options. For example, we're exploring some ideas around an apprenticeship type scheme for social justice and social activism around climate, which is a huge challenge. We should be training and paying young people to do that. It's a real challenge to bring young people into the Village Hall Climate Committee, for example, and we need to think of ways about encouraging citizenship and social innovation that encourages that. So I'll jump over to Alice first about citizenship, particularly in the context of the Northeast.
Yeah, no, hi, thanks. No, I think, well, in terms of the question about citizen over consumer identity, I think one of the things you can do today when your inboxes are being flooded with emails telling you to buy things is hit that unsubscribe button each time. It's there's ways in which we can push back against what we're being fed all the time. And I think in terms of the Northeast, there's a realization, there's a Northeast NESCAN, Northeast Communities Action Networks coming together. That's lots of community-based groups coming together to take action on climate change, in their small communities and then part of a wider group. And it's that element of speaking out kind of in your context and thinking about how you and your community are acting, supporting shop local if you're shopping, supporting at this time of year alternative gifts. Doesn't have to, resist buying the novelty gift and things. There's ways in which we can both make a difference in our everyday habits, but also in terms of who we're connecting with in our communities. So do get in touch with NESCAN if you're in the Northeast and want to kind of find out more about that way.
John, citizenship, Black Friday today, isn't it? This is everything.
Indeed.
Here we go.
Yeah, this is a huge, evidently another huge question. One of the problems is we're utterly pervaded by consumerist messages. Everything we're asked to aspire to, the leading figures in our society, the icons in our society, it's all about aspiration. It's all about owning things. That's how you're successful. That's how your status is secured. We're actually moving more in that direction now. We see young kids now, they all want to be YouTube influencers. When people go into social media space, there's constant clickbait that directs them to products. It's all pervasive. Everything about our culture is about asking us to be consumers. Now, this is not the first time this has happened. In the 1920s, this is when all of this started. And when mass production techniques became possible, we had to change the consciousness of generations that had been encouraged to be thrifty and self-denying. It was only the wealthy who were involved in conspicuous consumption. The rest of the population had been encouraged to believe that their reward would come in heaven and that being hardworking, thrifty and self-denying was quite good, was a moral attribute that was admired. But then the advertising industry, people like Stuart Ewan talked about captains of consciousness. They changed the consciousness of a generation to make them, as I said, more wasteful, and to see consumer products as a way of expressing their identity and their belonging to particular groups. It's not that difficult to overturn, but what you've got to do is turn off that tap. An example being, in the 1940s, or in the 1930s, late 30s, early 40s, when we had the war, suddenly advertisers turned to turning off the waste messages, to messages of, you know, recycle things, repair. Your duty as a citizen is to conserve, not waste, because of the contingencies necessary during wartime. So this can be done. It depends on the messages that are allowed to be circulated and who controls those medium, and they need to be. We know that given the destructive aspects of social media, there's a problem here. We don't want to censor. There are problems with censorship, but we've got to really consider as a society what the web is for and what social media is for, and how much license it should have to push what is now an environmentally destructive discourse.
Thanks, John. I'm going to go to some of the questions at the bottom of the list because we're starting to push close to time. David's also been able to join us from the internet problems, but we won't get time to see his talk today. I hope that's okay, but I'm very happy to bring David in to answer or contribute to some of the questions, if that's possible. And so this is probably one of the biggest questions of the day, and I'd just like a really succinct response from everybody around this. But does the panel believe that COP26 was a success? This is the first post-COP26 event. So, was COP26 a success? Who wants to start?
I can take I can add something. Hi. I think in short, both and, yes, but I think one of the things we have to remember with something like COP26 is COP happens every year. It happens in Glasgow this year, so we were incredibly aware of it. But the meetings for negotiation also go on throughout the year. And so I think what I take from the big kind of pinnacle COP26 is how much we've moved over the period of time. And in some ways that's good, and in some ways that's not good. But I think that the issues, we're talking here about adaptation, and I think one of the main things for me, as you say, is that raising of adaptation on the international agenda, and hopefully the money that has been committed to follow. I think that's one of the, as always, the challenge with all these things is what's the follow through.
I'd agree with that. Well, and other panel members, Jenny, John, Jenny. Sorry to put you on the spot there.
I I agree completely. I guess one of the successes will be, do we actually achieve some of these pledges? And we don't know that yet. So while some of them look really good on paper, let's just make sure that actually they follow through into policy. So at the moment, there was a lot of good words, and I'm hopeful that some of this will go forward. I'm hopeful some of it will change. I know it isn't all going to. But yes, it didn't sort of go as far as I thought it, or hoped it might. But I think we need to sort of say, well, some things were said, and let's really focus on trying to get these done. In another year, there may be other discussions, but let's not just lose some of them, would be my thoughts.
John.
Yeah, I think successful, I think only in the sense that when these ideas proliferate, ordinary people start to think about it, the public start to think about them more. There's been a long litany of these kind of meetings where charters are advanced and aspirations are noted, and it's almost as though providing the charter and it's job done. And as Jenny and Alice have said, it needs to be followed up by real action and there'll be resistance to that real action by lots of the interests that want this to be a very gradualist process. I think what we'll find is, as public consciousness of this, and COP helps raise public consciousness, is also confronted with the reality, and that we've seen more movement this year because people are beginning to realise climate change is something real. The climate deniers are becoming less plausible by the day, and that gives me hope that there will be something real that follows this up. So certainly not a qualified success. We still have the consumerist growth model that hasn't really been challenged. It has to be challenged, but it's baby steps down the right road. We'll see where it goes.
Thanks, John. David, have we got you there? I'm not sure if we can reach you or not.
Can you hear me?
We can. Hi.
I'm not going to tempt fate by turning on my camera, I'm afraid. I'm very, very sorry. Actually, this is particularly so because I actually addressed this in the talk. But my focus was on the kind of the nature side of things, and particularly the deforestation, the Declaration on Forests and Land Use. And I mean, I'm not an optimistic person. I mean, it was the latest in a long line of declarations on forests. If you go back to the New York Declaration, for instance, was very similar in many ways. What's different this time is that there does appear to be quite a lot of finance behind it, or committed finance, and particularly so from the private sector, which is relatively new. So that's where I place my optimism. But as you've all said, and it's totally correct, it will need to be monitored and followed up, and we need to maintain the pressure. And I think John is especially correct that the optimism derives from the initiatives at local levels that are stimulated by all of the publicity that's been around this.
I certainly felt by attending COP that that one of the things I noticed, I felt it was a success. You're never going to get everything you want in a negotiation of nearly 200 countries talking about their sustainability, climate, energy futures. So I think there was a lot to celebrate, in particular in terms of adaptation. I think adaptation really got on the agenda for the first time, really for a long time, particularly with the commitment to doubling of adaptation funding. The adaptation fund, which was relatively small at about 350 million, but it's a starting point, and that's grants, not loans. So I think there is a much more, and the loss and damage discussions were also wasn't the best outcome for loss and damage, but it got onto the agenda, and it's pushing forward. And it was explained to me quite neatly that it's mitigation, and then adaptation, and then loss and damage. If adaptation fails, we're into loss and damage. So let's try and get the adaptation right. And put a lot more effort into that. The other thought, the non-official aspect of COP26, I felt, was the huge role of civil society coming to the fore in these international negotiations, the sense of connection with other communities around the world, the ability to meet with people from around the world, and the collective pressure put on governments. I think that's a real step change. And I think that's what has to happen now over the 12 months as we pass from the international community back to domestic climate policies and action. So I'm going to try and squeeze in two more questions. There's a question here, Inez, I'm just going to pick randomly now. Attended an event on sustainability and resilience in cities, which highlighted the importance of biodiversity in urban spaces. And I think during lockdown, city dwellers came much more aware of nature and wildlife in their local area. How can we create resilient urban ecologies? I'm going to ask David what David prepares for that. I'm going to certainly say in my work in Aberdeen, in St. Fittick's, we've seen the incredible importance, the value of an urban green space there. It's not just a park and some swings and some grass. It is a reservoir of health and well-being. It is a place of community. Communities come together and develop sense of place. This has real spin-off effects for concrete effects for resilience. It also provides valuable ecosystem services around carbon sequestration, flood mitigation and coastal protection, for example. And those values need to be considered and incorporated into any future development around the south of the city. They can't be ignored. They're central, and they need to be factored in so we can actually link mitigation and adaptation and resilience together as we go forward. And that's the challenge as we go through this master planning process to get that right. David, urban green space and urban ecologies.
Yeah, and the key word here is connectivity. So we need to make sure that they're designed in a spatially appropriate way, such that we can allow such elements of biodiversity that exist in urban environments to move around our cities. And Aberdeen City is actually on this. There's the Aberdeen City Green Space projects. You can go onto the City Council website and look at a map of Aberdeen green spaces. So it's actually a really good case study for how to manage the biodiversity in for resilience, taking account of spatial planning.
And I guess part of the challenge is how do we take those really critical values and those critical contributions of green space to things like well-being? How do we really make that a key part of the local planning process, for example? Alice, do you have any views on incorporating those sorts of values into planning or project development?
I think there's yeah, I mean, I think it should be, and you'll talk to planning people, and they know and they want to integrate these factors into that. But I think there's the kind of community level, you know, if you're objecting to a planning application or if you're asking about planning information, mention some of the issues about diversity, biodiversity and green space, and, you know, tell your councillors as well that these are important to you. I think one of the things last year, a simple change, was there was less mowing of grass last year because of the pandemic, and that still brings out the challenge of, is this, you know, is this looking messy or is it looking beautifully diverse? And there's different viewpoints because of how we've been trained to think it looks messy, whereas actually we need to kind of relearn that that's actually beautifully diverse. So I think the other thing I would say is support councillors. If you know, write to your council and say, I love that the green space outside is, or the verges are left, you know, to grow over the summer, so that they can then get the support to make the decisions they need to.
Thanks, Alice. That's really great. It's now time. It's 2 minutes past 12. I'm just going to ask the panel if there's any concluding comments they would like to make. We haven't been able to get to all of the questions. There's been a whole bunch there, which has been fantastic. So thank you to the audience. Panelists, any closing comments that you would like to make before we wrap up? None from John, none from Alice. Jenny?
I just think we've had a really good discussion. And it's brought up some really interesting things and things to go away and think about of what we can do going forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. Adaptation is only going to get, and linking that to resilience is already a strong agenda, but it's only going to become even more central. And some of the issues raised about citizenship and consumption are not going away, John. If that's correct, they are really things that we need to consider going forward. So. Yeah. I'd like to thank all our panelists for some great presentations today and some really insightful and food for thought on Friday to go forward. Great topics, really good detail, very complex issues, you know, global to local and back again, and adaptation and resilience. So fantastic set of presentations. Thank you very much to the audience as well for the great questions. And certainly if you keep engaged in this topic with us, you can contact us on at the University of Aberdeen via our interdisciplinary research centres, which are all represented today. Alice at the James Hutton Institute as well. Do please keep in touch as we continue to research and develop and discuss these issues in public discourse going forward. So thank you very much for your time today. Have a wonderful Friday. Stay warm and dry. It's blue skies again out there, and we'll see you again soon. So thanks very much.